Hey everyone, this is Rocky, back with the next video in our professional communication modules, and this time we're switching from conciseness to preciseness. And when I talk about preciseness, what I mean is that we're just trying to pick the most accurate words that we can. This is going to help your readers understand your ideas better. It's going to make your writing much easier to read, and it's going to allow them to focus on the main ideas without having to stop and decipher what you mean or potentially be confused. So the goal when you're writing, in addition to having good ideas to start with and being very clear and concise, as we talked about in previous videos, is to be as precise as you possibly can. So in some fields it might not be so important, but in the finance field it's essential. You're making important recommendations to people, how they're going to handle their money in a lot of cases. Take, for example, the idea of recommending a stock buy to potential investors. Okay, they're not going to misunderstand whether you're saying buy, hold, or sell, but you really want to be clear why you're recommending this, because those factors could easily change quickly, and that might affect their decision. So they really need to understand why you're recommending things, and to do that, you have to be very accurate with your word choices, and it has to be a conscious effort. So let's look at some practical strategies that you can start to employ right away to maximize your precision. We'll look at 8 strategies. They fall into 4 themes: choosing more precise words, the power of verbs, specifying what you mean, and maximizing precision. Okay, let's talk about choosing precise words. There are different kinds of words in the English language, of course. One of them is adjectives, and you can avoid vague adjectives by obviously being more specific, or just explaining the idea in more detail, or using both strategies. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about here. Look at an example. Okay, in this sentence, multiple regression is bad for analysis. You can stop and try to pick out the vague word in the sentence if you like. The vague word, of course, is bad. Usually you don't want to use the words good or bad in formal writing, not because they sound informal, although that's part of it. The more important reason is just that they're unclear. We can slightly improve this by picking a more precise adjective. So this is one of the approaches I mentioned on the previous slide. So multiple regression is incorrect for analysis. So incorrect is a little more precise than bad. It gives some idea of an appropriate fit for the data, but it doesn't quite say that outright. So there is still some potential for ambiguity here. So we can be really precise by just specifying what we mean. So, for example, for our analysis, structural equation modeling is more appropriate than multiple regression because the former allows for simultaneous evaluation of model construct relationships. So it just explains exactly why. Now, it depends on the context of what you're writing. Some contexts it might not make sense to explain so much. For example, if your readers obviously know what you're talking about, then you might be able to use the second option. But when you're not sure, it's better to err on the side of being clear and accurate. Although conciseness is very important, as we discussed in the previous video, the number one thing is to be clear with your ideas. So be clear first and then try to be concise. Similar to using vague adjectives, we want to avoid using vague nouns. A common culprit is the word things. So a balance sheet is one of the things a company uses to show assets. This is just kind of an empty word. It's a lazy approach. We can do much better than that. So here we might say instruments or tools or whatever word you think is best. We could even make this a little more concise. So this is an example of how first we make our idea clear, and then we try to write it a little more concisely. So company use balance sheets to show assets. That would be a slightly different emphasis. So we might want the second option, but if it didn't matter in the particular context we were writing in, then we could use the more concise option. Let's take a look at another example of a vague noun that might be a little less extreme than the last example. Interest rate swaps are a financial instrument. This looks to be a perfectly okay sentence, and it's not bad. But we could specify the idea of financial instrument here because it's a more particular type of instrument. So IRSs are a derivative instrument. That would be one way to say it. We can improve it further by interest rate swaps or a liquid financial derivative instrument. Again, it depends on the context. You might not need to include all this information, or you might. So you have to decide based on your readership, based on the document, what you think the level of specificity is, the most appropriate level of specificity is for your readers there. Okay, so we can combine these approaches as well. We want to, again, use precise adjectives and precise nouns. Here's a sentence where we have both a vague adjective, the word good, and a somewhat vague noun. This is okay, changes, but again, we can probably choose slightly more accurate words. So instead, we can say the policy has made considerable improvements. Considerable is more specific than good, and improvements is more specific than changes because it shows the direction of the change. We could even improve this further by just saying exactly what we mean. So in 2 years, the policy has reduced the ratio of CEO compensation to employee pay in Fortune 500 companies from 251 to 7 to 1. And again, this is a choice that you'd have to make about the level of specificity, but this last sentence gives us much more concrete information that we can use to decide whether we like the author's argument or not. This second sentence might be a good topic sentence. Probably we could even specify that a little bit more. And then maybe this might be a good sentence in the body of the paragraph, this third one. But it depends. But I wanted to show you how you can go step by step up a little bit. So the first step would just be to pick more precise adjectives and nouns. And the even better step, when possible, is to just specify exactly what you mean, either with data or through examples. Let's look at one more example of combining the approaches where we have both vague adjectives and nouns. So we're just trying to pick the most precise words. So it doesn't matter too much that it's an adjective or a noun. I just use those examples because it tends to happen a lot. It could be other types of words as well. Okay, but here's a sentence where I would argue that's a little bit vague. So Smith's theory introduces new aspects to our understanding of turnover. Much more precise. Smith's theory introduces the idea of company-wide employee satisfaction, which helps human resources scholars better understand how satisfaction affects subordinates' attention to leave. Put your video on pause and try to find all of the ways that this second sentence improves upon the first sentence in terms of precision. Because there are several improvements here. The second sentence does a lot. So take a moment and see what you can think of. Okay, so I'm going to give the ideas that I had, and I think that it improves the sentence in a lot of ways. It specifies what aspect we're talking about. So this word aspects, sometimes the word factors, those words sound okay, but often when you stop and think about them, we can improve them a bit more. So now we're specifying which aspect, company-wide employee satisfaction, which is different than, for example, individual employee satisfaction. The second sentence replaces the word are with the group of people most relevant to the point. So a lot of times we'll use the words we, are, or us. It's called the editorial we, and we just assume that the reader will understand which group of people we're referring to. But are you referring to analysts, to scholars, to a specific group of people, top level executives in Fortune 500 firms? Who is it exactly that's giving the opinion or doing the action in the sentence? Second sentence also specifies who the turnover applies to, subordinates. So we're not talking about CEO turnover, for example. It also specifies the turnover construct, intention to leave, because there are several of them in the literature that are analyzed. And it specifies the specific relationship under study rather than referring to the broad concept of turnover by itself. So exactly what's being studied here. So this sentence is longer. So again, we're always trying to balance clarity and conciseness. This sentence is twice as long as the original. So we have to have a good justification for doubling the word count. But all of these reasons here combine to form a very strong justification for this sentence. So this is just much more informative, specific, and the reader's getting a lot more value here. So again, the idea that we're coming back to is to just say exactly what you mean. Okay, let's move on to the next strategy, which is choosing between similar words. This is an issue of both precision and conciseness. I see this quite often where people will try to use two nouns that mean almost the same thing or two adjectives that mean almost the same thing. So, for example, the policy has made considerable changes and improvements. We have both changes and improvements. It's not necessary to say both. So from the perspective of conciseness, we can just pick one. From the perspective of preciseness, we would want to pick the one that's most accurate, most informative. And in this case, like we discussed before, improvements is a little more accurate than changes because it shows the direction of the change. So assuming that's true, then we would use improvements. Example with an adjective where I think this is even more common. Okay, technically these are gerunds, but the point is that a lot of times people will add 2 or 3 adjectives or other descriptors to explain the idea, where that's okay if the adjectives or descriptors are different and giving unique information. But in this case, there's a lot of overlap here between falling and weakening. I would probably just pick the one that I think is most informative. Probably I would just say falling. I think it's concrete. It explains the decrease in the price. It's simple, but it's probably the better choice in my opinion. Okay, let's move on to the next theme, which is the power of verbs. Now, we saw how verbs can help our conciseness in the previous video, but let's look at also how they can help our precision. Overall, when you're picking your verbs, you want to focus on verbs that express action, what people are doing, rather than how they're being. So we talked about those weak verbs, especially to be and to have. The economy's outlook is good. It's okay. We have a weak verb, and we're relying on an adjective, and our adjective isn't even that good. Even if we updated this adjective to something a little more specific, we still have a weak verb. Instead, we could just explain exactly what we mean. Let's pick a doing or an action verb. GDP grew 4%, and analysts predict twice as much growth. So we're saying exactly what we mean. We're giving much more valuable information to the reader, and by forcing ourselves to pick a verb of action, we're also forcing ourselves to give more specific information. So try not to rely so much on the verb to be plus an adjective. It's kind of a lazy fallback method that, unfortunately, a lot of us use too often. Let's take another look at what I'm talking about here. So I named this a different strategy, but it's a very similar idea. So in the previous video on conciseness, we looked at how we can use verbs instead of nouns to improve our conciseness. In this video, we're looking at precision, so we can take a look at the example again that we just had in the previous slide. And as I briefly mentioned, we could change the word good to another adjective. So this would be slightly better. Optimistic gives us more information than good. But still, we're not telling the reader exactly what we mean. So perhaps the sentence could be a good transition sentence, maybe to move into a new idea. But then you would make sure you want to follow it up with something more specific, or you could just use this more specific sentence instead of the previous one. So again, we're focusing on our verbs, what happened exactly, who said what, who did what. Try to use your verbs more, and again, try to rely less on this to be and to have, plus other words. Okay, let's move on to the next theme, which is specifying your meaning. Well, we've been doing that for the whole presentation, but we'll give some more examples of this. So another problem with this same sentence that we've been looking at is that it doesn't say who is giving us the information. So is it according to the author, or is it according to some source? So it's always good to specify our source, and we've talked about how to cite that information in our earlier videos. In the example sentence that we've been looking at, it specifies that, okay, it's Morgan Stanley analysts, or it could be analysts from wherever I just used as an example. Another common problem when people forget to specify who they're talking about is when they start a sentence with the word many or some. So they say some believe, or some think, or many think, and we don't know many who or some who. Are we talking about all financial analysts, or just analysts from a particular company, or are we talking about scholars or executives from a certain group of firms, or whatever? But you just want to explain who it is you're saying. So don't rely on words like many or some without putting a descriptor after it. You can use the words, just make sure you specify what you mean. So again, we're trying to avoid these lazy approaches of just assuming the reader understands who or what we're talking about. We want to spell it out for them so that there's no confusion about our ideas, our recommendations, and our arguments. All right, let's move on. One other example in this sort of lazy approach theme that I've been talking about is the use of vague pronouns. So often we'll use a pronoun such as it, or him, or they, or in this case, this, to refer to something, and we'll just assume that the reader understands what we're talking about. This issue can be particularly problematic when we try to refer back to something in a preceding sentence. It can still even be confusing within the same sentence, but if we look at this example here, the word this, what does it refer back to exactly in these previous sentences? It could refer back to a couple things: the growth, the industry, the unemployment. So we want to specify for the reader which of these things that we're referring to. Or if we're referring to all of them, then we could say, for example, these trends or these X's. So you just always want to say this X or that X or these X's, or you can even say the X, but just put an X there, put something, specify what you're talking about. Don't assume that the reader can understand it, because a lot of times what happens is the reader either doesn't understand it because it's ambiguous, or the reader will understand it if they stop and think about it, but then they have to stop and think. So we don't want to make our reader have to decipher our meaning. Let's just clarify it for them and make it easy. Another example of vague pronouns is the word it, as I briefly mentioned in the previous slide. It's very common for people to use the word it at the beginning of a sentence to refer back to something in a previous sentence. This approach is usually a very bad idea. Here, the policy affected the program. It was instituted last year. I used a very simple example, but we don't know if it refers to the policy or the program. So if, for example, we were saying that the policy affected the program, we could state it directly like this. If it was the other way around, maybe we could say the policy affected the program that was instituted last year, or we could find another way to word that. Okay, so in general, be very, very careful with the word it when you're trying to refer back to something. It's usually not a good idea. If it's a short sentence and the pronoun comes within the same sentence and it's 100% clear what it refers to, then of course it's fine. And probably that's the most natural way to write the sentence, but just be careful. Let's move on to our final theme and example, which has to do with maximizing precision. We've been trying to do that throughout all the examples here, but I think this is even a step higher that some people don't think about. So we want to try to use words in their primary definition. Here's an example that comes up pretty often. The word while. The word while can actually mean about 5 things, and just when it's used as a conjunction. So also it has other uses, but it could mean during the time that, for example, if we have 2 actions occurring at the same time, like I read a book while my wife watched TV. It can also mean although to show contrast, or whereas, which is slightly different. It can also mean and, it can mean but. So we don't want to use a word that has 5 potential definitions and let the reader sit there and try to figure out exactly which one they're using. Now, of course, a lot of times, probably most of the time, they will figure it out, but also many times they'll have to quickly stop. Like they might just hiccup while they're reading, pause, just double check and verify the meaning. We don't want to make our readers do that. So if we use the word in its primary definition, which in this case, as a conjunction, is during the time that. So that means that this is sort of the first thought that people will tend to have when they see the word. So we want to reserve this word for when we're referring to 2 actions at the same time. Like, again, I used that one example. I read the book while my wife watched TV. Then we can use while. In all other cases, we want to use these other words because they're more precise. So if we mean although, then we use that. If we mean whereas, then we mean that, and so forth. So again, this is just a higher level of precision, and it wouldn't matter in a lot of other fields, but it does matter in your field. You want to be as precise as possible so that the readers can understand your ideas without any distractions or potential confusion. Another example is the word since, which can either refer to time as a reference point, or it can mean because or given that. And the primary definition that we in the dictionary, and also what we think of, is the one referring to time. So we should use the word since when we refer to instances of time. For example, policy has been in effect since 1998. That would be a good situation to use the word since. But we don't want to use it for the situations where we mean because or given that. In those cases, we just use those other words. Okay, so that's it for our strategies on precision. I hope that you guys got a lot out of these videos, and that you can start to use these strategies of conciseness and precision in your writing right away. If you have any questions about them, please let me know.